Yes, we can.
First of all, I would like to thank you for being here all. Thank you, Fadi. Thank you, Aya, as well for inviting me to this conference. My name is Hala Alnaji, and I am very glad to be part of this conference, actually, to present my paper titled Mourning as Praxis, Catastrophe, Knowledge, and the Refusal of Closure. Actually, this research and this research paper that I'm presenting now is part of my PhD research project. So I would, rather than presenting this as a conventional academic paper, I will approach it differently maybe, and I will tell maybe the story of my PhD thesis, how it has been transformed and how it has become what I now described as a thesis in Mourning. Yes, okay. So I began actually my PhD as a research by design project titled Social Phenomena and the Power of a Space Encounter with a Spatial Injustice. And it aimed actually to imagine recovery spaces in Gaza Strip through counter mapping. However, after like 5 years of working on this research, I found myself like writing its final chapter under the shadow of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And the aggression that began in October 2023 has continued to nearly like 2 years, dismantling not only Gaza's urban fabric, but we can say that it's also the concept. We are talking also about the conceptual, historical, and spatial configuration and coordinates that had guided my work from the beginning. So my dissertation actually develops a layered of and we can say multidimensional portrait of Gaza Strip approached across scales, from the aerial to the subterranean, and from the domestic to the infrastructural, from the material to the atmospheric of Gaza Strip. So rather than going through the entire thesis, I will just briefly move across its chapters very quickly. So it consists actually of 7 chapters where I started to map Gaza and doing the investigation about Gaza. I started with an overview chapter where I am framing Gaza especially, and then in the second chapter, which entitled My Gaza Chronicle, I'm trying to talk about the history of Gaza from the lens from a personal lens and from the intergenerational lens, like my father, my grandfather. And then the muted shifts chapter, which talking about the spatial justice and the dialectics of a space in the context of Gaza. The fourth chapter, Mapping the Unseen, is also talking about, we can say, the invisible and the hidden geographies of Gaza. We have Gaza Vertical, where I'm talking also about the sky of Gaza, and going also down to talk about also the tunnels and the underground of Gaza. The sixth chapter is talking about Gaza ethereality, where I'm talking about Gaza's wave war dynamics, where I'm talking about Gaza darkness, fire, smoke, and soundscape of the city, and so on. And the final chapter ends with, of investigation, of course, and mapping, is talking about the edge. I called it the edge, which is talking about the border lines and the borderscape of Gaza, and also the sea as well. And across actually these chapters, Gaza is traced, like we can say, vertically and horizontally from drone-filled skies to underground tunnels, and from the coastal seams to border conditions. And before the works arrived to the threshold of the final chapter, design chapter, where I can say that here I started questioning myself. So by the time when I reach the final chapter, much of the geography I had documented had already been erased. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, we can say. Large parts of the Gaza region had been transformed beyond recognition, and the maps I had carefully produced no longer matched the world they sought to describe. So at that moment, I was confronted with a fundamental question: what does a dissertation become when its subject is under active annihilation? So, over the course of this research, the work had undergone continuous revision, updating, rewriting, and reconstructing in response to the each escalation, because we were like in a course of violence all the time. So, names, coordinates, and images became unstable. What I had once understood as the history of Gaza revealed itself as a provisional. So destruction was moving actually faster than the process of archiving that I'm doing and the process of narration and researching. And through this, I came to understand that a doctoral dissertation actually is not separated from the violence it studies, and it cannot remain detached from the terrain it seeks to understand. And from that point, actually, I think that the method started to collapse. This condition actually did not only affect the object of the research, it exposed the limits of the methods themselves. So, cartographic mapping, which in fact assumes that space can be stabilized long enough to be observed and measured and represented, but under these conditions of ongoing destruction, this assumption is no longer holding. So it no longer holds. So maps that were once accurate became obsolete. Not because they were like incorrect, but because the reality they referred to no longer existed in the same way. And at the same time, when we are talking also about naming, also began to fail, like because places continued to exist in language, but became like detached from their physical locations. A neighborhood could still be remembered, but no longer found. And even when we come to talk about time, time also became unstable. There was no longer a clean distinction between before and after. The archive could not keep up, and the documentation also, we can say, arrived too late or referred to something that had already changed again. So, what collapsed then was not only the representation, but also the very assumption that reality can be stabilized long enough to be known. So, first, with this collapse, I did not actually attempt to revert the method or restore the object. Instead, the research underwent a transformation. Mourning emerged not as an emotional response, but as a methodological condition. And this shift, actually, I can say that began almost accidentally. And I will start now to tell the story of how this thesis start to become a mourning practice. So one day, while working with a printed map of Gaza, uh, with all the ideas and the emotions come up from everywhere, especially like the news that is keep rolling around me about Gaza, about explosion somewhere, about targeting somewhere. So with this stress, I was like just continue working on my PhD and working with this printed map of Gaza. I folded it instinctively. Without like a theoretical intention. And the fold actually cut across neighborhoods I could no longer reach. We can say that I could no longer reach. It brought like distant parts of the city into contact. It disturbs, and I found it that it disturbed the fixed logic of the map. And at that moment, actually, something shifted. Geography collapsed and a different spatial possibility emerged. So folding here, actually, I can say that it became the first sketcher of mourning. It allowed me to think of Gaza not as a fixed service, but as a material that could bend, hold, and reconfigure relations. And the stitching, actually, we can say that came later as a second gesture. So when the map could not longer hold together, I began to sew it. The needle pierced the surface, and the map transformed from a flat representation into something with depth, almost like a body. So the stitch became a very real connection between places I could no longer walk. And the map was no longer something to look at, it became something to touch. And that was for me actually very inspiring. So through this process, fabric emerged not as a metaphor, but as a method. And this marks a broader shift from drawing to stitching, and from overview, we can say, to proximity, and from knowledge to relations. So drawing actually requires, as we know, requires distance and stability. However, stitching operates through touch, repetition, and closeness. So mapping traditionally relies on overview, the ability to see the whole. But what remained possible was proximity, like because now we are working through fragments, details, and partial conditions, not a whole image of Gaza. So. Finally, I found that the research actually moved from knowledge toward like relations, and the goal was no longer to produce a stable account, but to remain with what is disappearing, without like claiming to capture it fully. So, in this sense, I think mourning became as a praxis, a way of thinking, making, and staying under condition where neither object or we can say nor method like also can hold. So through these gestures, actually, Gaza began to appear not as a fixed surface, but as a fabric, layered, torn, and continuously reassembled. So fabric offers a way of to engage actually destruction without flattening it. It allows for ambiguity, fragmentation, and embodied memory. So, unlike maps, it operates at the scale of the hand and the body, introducing a logic of care as well, rather than control. So, this shift actually is both material and epistemological, resisting the abstractions of conventional way of mapping. So what emerges from the methodological shift is not stable from the knowledge. Sorry, it's not a stable, we can say it's not a stable form of knowledge, but a different mode of presence. So the work produces fragments, traces, and partial forms that do not fully stabilize. These can be understood as spectral conditions, presence that are neither fully present nor fully absent. So knowledge in this context does not accumulate towards clarity or conclusion. It appears intermittently, like remains partial and resists totalization. So this mode of working does not fully belong within conventional academic structures. It, as we know, because and it does not also follow like linear argumentation or aim toward definitive conclusions. Instead, it operates through fragments, collective gestures, and process-based practices. And in this sense, I think the work resonates with what can be understood as the undercommons. But we are not talking here about a fixed place, but we can talk about a way of operating things and against dominant system of knowledge. So this actually approach is developed in the design chapter through a layered methodology, we can say that. And I'm bringing here some of these images, which it begins actually with mourning as a spatial method expressed through gestures such as like folding, stitching, and the city is approached as fabric shifting mapping towards material engagement. And this extends through like individual mapping diaries, which I'm now sharing with you, which generates spatial knowledge under conditions of erasure and culminates in the, I will show you. So these one of these diaries. And actually, at the end, it culminates in the Stitching Gaza project, where mapping becomes actually a collective practice. And this piece was presented and was also produced in Cairo by displaced community of artists stuck in Cairo, and they worked on it and producing this, practicing, we can say, this mourning through stitching. So the map actually transforms into a shared spatial body that, and the outcome is not a finished object, we can say, but we can say that it becomes an open condition. Okay, and this actually brings me to the final point after that into this presentation. So this research does not arrive at a conclusion, not because it is incomplete, but because completion would require a false stabilization, and that does not exist anymore. So instead, it remains in relation to Gaza as a condition that continues to unfold. And mourning in this work was not only a methodological response, but also, for me, it was an ethical necessity, a responsibility towards the research and towards myself. Because I'm going also, while working on this research, I was going through a continuous violence and loss myself, and which it's become also and making me under pressure and under stress all the time. So it became a space, mourning here became a space that allowed me to continue intellectually and emotionally. And it functioned not as a resolution, we can say, but as a condition of endurance. And Gaza actually exists here within a continuous state of absence, neither fully present nor fully gone, but held through memory and lived experience all the time. So it is within this tension that mourning becomes necessary. And for this reason, the research aligns with the conference, I think, by proposing mourning not as an aftermath, but as a vital practice of thinking, making, knowing under conditions of ongoing absence and erasure. A practice that allows us to maybe remain with what cannot be fully held without forcing it into a closure. Thank you, everyone.